Hey guys, Chris here with theGoodOldGamer. So just about 2 weeks ago, we got to see AMD's keynote at CES 2019. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, throughout the whole thing, I was hoping to not see a Vega card be announced. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we got. Now, the reason for that will be explained in this video, and it's because it shows me that AMD clearly has no idea how to actually compete with Nvidia. And this got me thinking about how was ATi so successful at competing with Nvidia, and AMD just keeps fumbling all over themselves. Between the RX 590 and this new Radeon VII graphics card, this distinctively tells me that they have no idea what it's actually going to take to beat Nvidia. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. We're going to do a little history lesson, go back in time, see what it was and when it was that AMD, or ATi rather, were successful against Nvidia, and kind of analyze what it was that they did that made them so successful. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to take a quick trip back down memory lane, and we're going to start with Radeon and GeForce. So GeForce came out before the Radeon branding and lineup came out. So starting off with the original Radeon, the 64 megabyte DDR, this was ATi's first real attempt at the gaming market. Now, they made the Rage cards and the Rage Pros, and those could play games, but really they were trying to hit OEMs with those. They were trying to get them in for MPEG-2 accelerated cards and get those into as many systems as possible. And that was actually a really smart move from them. They also had the all-in-wonder cards, and a lot of multimedia stuff was really what ATi was going for. But with Radeon, they started really focusing in on gaming. And on their first attempt out, it is no question that ATi set out to produce a card or a GeForce 2 GTS killer. And realistically, they were able to achieve that, and they were very, very competitive with both Nvidia and 3DFX. And okay, that's pretty good for your first time out. You're very competitive with the main competition out there. Next, they went ahead and released the Radeon 8500. This competed against the GeForce 3. Now, I had to go ahead and use this article because a couple weeks after launch, they got new drivers, which really changed the whole situation. At launch, the 8500 could really only match the GeForce 3 Ti 200 or the regular GeForce 3, which is weaker than the Ti 500, of course. But after the new drivers came out, we can see here that they basically flip-flop depending on games and settings. So overall, it was pretty much a tie yet again. So ATi was able to compete with Nvidia at this particular spec. And then came the hammer. After that, ATi launched the Radeon 9700 Pro. And undoubtedly, this was the king. This won the generation and hands down just destroyed the GeForce 4. And in here you can see there's nothing Nvidia could have done to prevent ATi from winning with the R300. So they had no shot at all. There's no driver that could be released that would give the GeForce 4 the power it needs to topple the 9700. And all their hopes were based on the NV30, which became the FX series, which, as we know, due to hindsight, also really couldn't compete with the 9700. So ATi's 9700 came out and crushed Nvidia's GeForce 4 generation and pretty much crippled the FX series as well. While the FX series was more competitive, of course, and that's the reason why the 9800 and 9800 XT came out, which were more powerful than the 9700, it was still competitive with Nvidia's top-of-the-line next-generation cards. And in the battle between GeForce and Radeon, ATi was the first company to take away a decisive victory. Next up came the X800 series from ATi. This competed with the GeForce 6000 series. And realistically, they put it succinctly right here. It's very clear that both Nvidia and ATi have strong offerings. With better competition in the marketplace, and Nvidia's differentiating themselves, offering richer feature set that does not necessarily translate into value unless developers start producing games that use those features. Doesn't that sound familiar? Except companies weren't applauded for new features until they were actually implemented. It's another reason why I'm doing this video, because reviews back in the day used to look at things a little bit more objectively. Consumers will be able to make choice without needing to worry about sacrificing real performance. Basically, this generation was a tie. So this was good on Nvidia. They were very far behind with the FX series, and they were able to come back. And basically, ATi just continued with the same sort of process that they were doing with the 9700, and it was still good enough to compete with this next generation from Nvidia. The following series was the X1000 series, the X1900 being the class leader, or the X1950, which came out after this, and that competed against the 7800 GTX and 7900 GTX, which was actually competing against this card. Once again, succinctly, they put it in just this one sentence. I'll spoil the results and make it clear that the X1900 XT and XTX are hands down the best cards out there right now. So they came on out, they kicked some ass, they changed things around a little bit. The X1900 was significantly better than the X1800, which was supposed to be the flagship. They retweaked their GPUs, came out with a better product, and they won the generation. And then came the GeForce 8800 GTX. And once again, they very succinctly summed it up in this one sentence. Architecturally, the G80 is a gigantic leap from previous generation of GPUs. It's the type of leap in performance that's akin to what we saw from the Radeon 9700 Pro. And that's really what it was. It was basically the next 9700 Pro to come out. And that's the reason why this card basically lasted 2 generations as well. The 9700 Pro was a 2-generation killer. The 8800 GTX was a 2-generation killer. But this marks the first time in GeForce versus Radeon that Nvidia had a decisive victory. Now, like any arms race, ATi realized that going bigger and bigger and bigger sometimes isn't the best option. And then they finally hit the nail on the head with the Radeon 4850 and 4870. So the RV770 really was the best weapon that ATi could use against Nvidia's ever-growing, ever more expensive GPUs. The Radeon HD 4870 and 4850 are both solid values and cards that would absolutely recommend to readers looking for hardware between $200 and $300 price points, which is most gamers. The fact of the matter is that by Nvidia's standards, the 4870 should be $400 and the 4850 should be about $250. You can look at it either way. AMD is giving you a better bargain or Nvidia is charging you too much. Either way, it's healthy competition in the graphics industry once again, after a far too long hiatus. This is kind of how we feel today. And that's after only 2 generations of Nvidia leading with the 8800 GTX. Now, unlike the previous generations where it was top-tier performance that we were evaluating, now we're talking about performance per dollar, performance per watt, and overall value. And this is really why this argument is harder to make, but it's very easy when I show you what I show you here in a sec. So we have the HD 4870 here, and if we take a look here, in comparison to the GTX 280, we can see that the GTX 280 is faster. It's 24% faster. This is basically how much faster the RTX 2080 Ti is over the GTX 1080 Ti, which realistically isn't that much, but it is what it is. Okay, so we see that this is a 150 watt TDP card, and it launched at $299. Now, if we take a look at the GTX 280, however, we see that this is a 236 watt TDP card, and with an MSRP price of $649. That means essentially 100 watts lower on the TDP and less than half the price, and you're within 24% of the performance. This was a decisive victory for ATi. Nvidia really couldn't do anything about this. They tried refreshing with the 285 and 275, and that did help out a bit. But then, of course, the Radeon 4890, which was just a binned 4870, came out, and that was even more competitive, honestly. So this is why, for this generation, we would definitely say the ATi cards won. You got within spitting distance performance for half the price. This was a decisive victory for ATi. Then, interestingly enough, ATi was able to bring out the HD 4870 before their competition. Typically, Nvidia seems to have been launching first in the generations, but in this instance, they were able to come out well before Nvidia's competition there. And realistically, it's a short and sweet one here because there's really no competition. Let's be clear, the 5870 is the single fastest GPU we have tested. So basically, this is the fastest GPU in the world, and it launched at an MSRP of $379. I want you guys to think about that for a sec. Back in 2009, so this is basically 10 years ago, 9.5 years ago now, the world's fastest single GPU cost $379. Now, ATi didn't throw out their strategy. They wanted to go ahead and keep using the more efficient approach to keep beating Nvidia over the head. And they did it again this generation. So if we compare the true competition, we had the Radeon HD 4870 here. Looking at that, it's 188 watt TDP, so it does consume a little bit more power. And they did go ahead and, I guess the launch price they have in here is $399, but whatever. We're only talking about 20 bucks. Either way, that's still an amazing value right there. So what was its competition? The GeForce GTX 480. So if we go down here, we can see that this is a 250 watt GPU, and this one came out at $499, so $100 to $120 more, and it came out 6 months later. So it's 6 months late in comparison to its competition and only offered 14% more performance. So this is obviously a clear win for ATi. They had the better price product, the performance was within spitting distance yet again, and it came out earlier so you could get your hands on it and mess with it even longer, which is really, really awesome. And then, of course, TDP and power consumption was significantly better. Now, putting all of that together, we can see that ATi was able to win 5 generations, lost 2 generations, and tied with Nvidia 3 generations. Nvidia, however, wins 2 generations, loses 5, and then also ties 3. I was going to say, there's no like playing with the numbers here, so you just kind of flip them around. But you can see that ATI's strategy to beat Nvidia was a convincing one. Now, AMD technically took over for ATi during the 5000 series, but ATi already had everything ready to go with their GPUs, so they didn't really have any effect on that generation. They basically just let it happen. It wasn't until the 6000 series of Radeon graphics that they really had their hands in the cookie jar and really got into things. And unfortunately for them, they weren't able to get the process shrink that they needed to make that generation really work. That really wasn't ATi's fault or AMD's fault. It was neither their fault on that one. However, that was definitely a win for Nvidia. But we all know that GCN has pretty much been the only architecture that AMD has been all the way in with the graphics division since they bought it. So pretty much since AMD really was in charge of everything, so from the 6000 series, which is just going to be an easy win for Nvidia. So if you want to just cross that out and not count it, that's fine. But looking at the that competition, the Radeon graphics under AMD has won 1 generation, lost 4, and tied none. And Nvidia has won 4, lost 1, tied 0. Now, if you're like, which one did they win? It's been made very clear that GCN was superior to Kepler. But the reason why I give Nvidia the win for that generation is much the reason why I give ATi the win for the 4870. It's because the GTX 680 was far more efficient and was able to compete with it at similar price points at the time. So I do give the 600 series the win over the 7000 series. You can debate that, you can call it a tie, but realistically at that point in time, due to the power efficiency, it was the better option. Now, right after that, we had the 700 series from Nvidia, and we had the R9 290 and 290X, which the 290X stomped the original Titan, which was a $1,000 GPU, and actually is still viable today. Steve over at Gamers Nexus just did a revisit with it, and you can see that it still competes with many of today's mainstream and even high-end-ish GPUs, if you consider something like the RX 590 a high-end-ish GPU. But this is a GPU from 2013 that is still viable today, and hands down, that was the best GPU that AMD has ever produced. And then, of course, NVIDIA wins Maxwell, Pascal, and then I didn't count Turing yet because we don't have a real competitor to Turing. the Radeon 7 is not a competitor to Turing in my book. It might be able to compete on price, it might be able to compete a little bit on performance, but if rumors out there are to be believed, there's a lot of people out there thinking that AMD's losing money on this, and I don't believe that that's the case. I don't think that they'd need mindshare that much that they would actually lose money. And maybe they are at that point. I mean, the RX 590 is a GPU that should have never existed. That's a lot of money they wasted developing that. And realistically, is a card that should not exist. And between the RX 590 and the Radeon 7, it's clear to me that AMD simply does not understand what ATi did to be successful. What ATi did is they knew the two ways to beat Nvidia were either with superior architecture, like they did with the 4870 and the 5870, and they were able to beat the crap out of their really expensive, large die, power-consuming GPUs with basically cheaper to produce, smaller die, and they won with architecture. Or the other way you have to beat them is with a freaking sledgehammer like the Radeon 9700 Pro and come over the top and beat them by such a wide margin that there's nothing that they can do about it. You have to build the biggest, the fastest, and most expensive GPU on planet Earth to beat them. And you have to have the architecture as well, or at least a competitive architecture, to even have a chance at that. So those are the only two ways to compete with Nvidia. And when you do that, you can have great success. Many people out there bought the Radeon 9700 Pro, and that filtered down to the rest of the lineup, because the rest of the lineup was essentially based off of the same technology, just scaled back. I remember a lot of people buying Radeon 9000s back then because they were cheap, and yeah, they were about half as fast, maybe a little slower than that, but they were a lot cheaper and could run games very well at the time. The ATi Radeon X1900 series was actually one of the more interesting ones because a mid-generation refresh, they actually tweaked the core design. Now, I'm unfamiliar with how they were able to do that in such a short period of time, unless this was at some point planned earlier, but that core change actually took them from being looking like they were going to lose the generation with the X1800, and then actually dominating the generation with the X1900 and X1950 series. Nvidia didn't even bother to try to compete because they knew what they had with the G80. And realistically, the G80 was fantastic. It was their Radeon 9700 Pro moment. And good on Nvidia. They went ahead and they pushed the market forward. They did push prices up with that, but at the same time, it was a monumental leap in performance, and it was worth it at the time. Now, it took them a little while until the 8800 GT, until that came out. It really didn't filter down to the mainstream, and that's because Nvidia, they tend to focus more on the high end, and that's just the way that their company works. And that's okay, because that's what they do. And they're going to keep pushing customers and keep pushing prices up. We know that's going to happen. It sucks for us as customers, and I've talked about that, but that's what they do as a company. And that's the reason why they can't win as many generations as they have been here recently. They need a competitor out there that has to keep them honest and basically keep them as the underdog. Even if they're selling more GPUs, they have to be losing either architecturally or they have to have the weaker GPU. That's the only way that prices stay reasonable and you get $400 flagship GPUs being released. Now, I'm sure AMD or ATi at the time probably wish that they sold the 5870 for a little bit more, but you know what? That's why it won the generation, is because they didn't price gouge. They did raise their prices, but they didn't go crazy with it. It was something reasonable. They offered crazy good performance for it, and they were the undisputed champion of the world there for 6 whole months. And that right there leaves a lot of mind share out in the market. And this is something AMD clearly does not understand. They need to win that way. You either need the better architecture or you need to have the fastest card, period. That's kind of what you need to do. You can't allow your competition to either have the best GPU or the best architecture, which Nvidia has both right now, which really means that there's really no reason to be considering AMD unless they have something at a very compelling price point, such as the RX 570s and RX 580s right now at $150 and $200. They're an amazing value, and you get free games. So if you factor those out, you're getting the cards for basically like $100, which is a super, super deal, or less than $100 in the case of the RX 470. So that's the only way that they can compete with having inferior architecture and not holding performance crown. So that's the reason why the Radeon 7, to me, it was just a massive disappointment because they're not winning on either of those fronts. And it took me a long time to figure out what it would take to beat Nvidia. But when you go through all those reviews and you see when ATi won and how they did it, those are the only two ways that will work. So AMD, if you're listening to this, that's how you win. If a GPU does not come up to snuff, don't release anything. It's better to be irrelevant than losing at this point, because you can just go away for a few years, work on something, come back, and if it's a good product, people will buy it. That's just the way it goes. And if Nvidia keeps raising the roof on performance per dollar, I mean, you can make a lot more money doing that in the future. I mean, that's sad to say because that sucks for us as customers, but that's just the way things are going. I'll talk more about that in a future video though. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Do you think that I'm right on this? Is that what you get from looking back at history? Is that the best possible way to compete? And I guess the same thing could apply for Intel. Intel should also pay attention to this because they're likely going to run into the same problems. They either need the better architecture or they need the best card in order to compete with Nvidia. But like I said, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. If you like this video, please hit that like button. Please subscribe. Please share with friends. That really helps me out. And that's all I have for today. And I will catch you guys in the next video.